Wired for Winning, celebrating the extraordinary minds of those with ADHD. Hey everybody, welcome to Wired for Winning again, and this week we have the wonderful Aestrid Solberg who is coming onto the podcast. It's very interesting, everybody, because I sent out a survey recently about Wired for Winning and how can we possibly get around other subject matters surrounding the ecosystem of ADHD. And very interestingly, I think something happened in the universe, because that day Aestrid reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm a parent of somebody with ADHD. I'd like to talk about it." And I said, "I'd be delighted." So, Aestrid, welcome to the show. I'm going to click my clapperboard. You're very welcome to the show. And I would love to hear your story, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, George. I'm really excited to be here and to share my story. So where would you like me to start?
Start wherever you want to, and we can move backwards and forwards in time if you want, but go back to the very beginning of when you kind of discovered ADHD in your life, as well, if that's okay.
Yeah. So I think the very first time, actually, funnily enough, and I know we weren't going to refer to this, was actually when you and I went out and had a meal and we were talking and you said, "You do realize you have ADHD, right?"
Was it
and
my
I was
fault?
Like, it was your fault. And I was like, that's interesting. And I kind of went away and thought about it and how reflected on my life. I didn't really know too much about it then, because it's like going back a little while, about 7 years, 6 years, whatever it was. And then the last 2 years, my youngest daughter, she was 15, 16 at the time, was really struggling coming back to school after COVID. She's always been a grade A student, always really enjoyed school, had a few challenges when she was younger about closing down in certain situations, but put that down to maybe being a bit shy, a bit pressurized, and didn't really kind of put things together. And so then things started to play out, and then we went down sort of some routes and found that actually she has ADHD. And so then that, as I started looking into her particular complexities, which is she has situational mutism, sometimes called selective mutism. We prefer situational. It's more known in the US than the UK. There's not a lot of material here in the UK, but it normally affects younger children in sort of like primary school age. And if it goes into, it doesn't often, because she's kind of missed being picked up at a younger stage. She clearly had it and it didn't get picked up. So therefore it led to the thing of, oh, okay, well, this is rare in sort of teen years, and how do we treat this? So we were down that whole sort of rabbit hole of ADHD, autism, selective mutism, all of these things. And then I started to realize, interesting. I used to do exactly the very same thing when I was a child. And I remembered a very particular instance when we were traveling across the US. We were stopping at all the roadside diners and everything, as you're doing your road trip. My mom would always ask me, "What would you like to eat? Can you tell the waitress what you'd like to eat?" And I mean, I was only like 3, 4 at the time. And every time I would close down in the situation and feel really conscious of myself and really, really not want to talk. And I recognized that behavior in what my daughter was experiencing. And so for me, it was like, okay, let's look into this a bit further. And I actually raised it with my dad, who sadly passed away in October of last year. And
sorry to hear that.
It's been quite difficult not being able to kind of go back on some things with him. But I did kind of raise it and say, "Oh, I've noticed these things." With my daughter, and then with me when I was younger, was there anything particular around this? And sort of starting to look at some of the other things that she had that were definitively ADHD, with losing her focus, feeling everything's going very fast in her head, wanting to kind of go faster, like class wasn't going fast enough for her, her learning wasn't going fast enough, feeling very exhausted, closing herself off after having a lot of interaction with people. So it was at that point that my dad said, "Oh, didn't we? Yeah, we never told you were diagnosed with ADHD when you were 7." And I was
Really?
like, "Oh, really?" And I was like, "Wow." And I was like, "Well, was I taking medication?" I was like, "Well, I haven't been taking any medication all these years, right?" And then my dad was like, "Well, do you remember when we told you had this liquid medicine and we said it was for your hay fever?" And I was
Okay.
like, "Yeah." I was like, "Actually, it wasn't." It was for your ADHD. And I was like, "Great." So my parents have been medicating me for like up until my mid-teens.
Okay.
And I never knew. I had a diagnosis of something that I didn't know.
That you didn't know.
And
Yeah.
then I started to really put the dots together. And the reason my dad, the reason my parents hadn't told me was because my dad's sister was schizophrenic, paranoid
Okay.
schizophrenic, and my mother had a real problem with things. And obviously, going back to 1970s, mid 1970s, people didn't know a whole lot, right? Anything that was associated with, the brain having an impact on your brain or your mental health or anything like that was quite taboo to discuss, let alone understand, because there wasn't much information out there.
Mm.
Certainly not for girls. So add a thing of being a girl, that kind of going between being shy, being chatty. Oh, these were all these kind of labels that were attached, and being a very active girl in that I was doing ballet all my childhood. And so I had my dopamine at a certain level anyway, so that I could burn that off. But then having these times where I was very chaotic, you'd open a cupboard door and you'd find all this paper screwed up and thrown in. And I'd have to do a big clear out and I was thinking, oh my God, this is so like my daughter, having to nag about cleaning and tidying and having these piles of monster shit everywhere and then going,
Yeah.
what is this? And then having a big binge on it and then going, oh, okay, that's all done. And then, a couple of months later saying, oh God, this
Files
monster
everywhere.
pile is just built up again, right? So there were all these kind of little things that started to build up. They were like little breadcrumbs. And it was like I was going into the forest, following all these breadcrumbs like Hansel and Gretel. Where is the cottage with the witch? Well, that was my parents in a way, because they hadn't told me what was really going on.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was kind of where it all started, sort of with my daughter's journey, and then seeing how it fed into my own.
And how old was your daughter when you first noticed that behavior? Was she quite
Very
young
young.
or?
No, very, very young. So she was probably about 2.5, 3. It was a birthday
Okay.
party,
Yeah.
and she had her friends around. It wasn't a big group; it was just a couple of people. And when we went to sort of do the cake and blowing out the candles, she had a complete meltdown
Right.
because it was like this thing of being the center of attention.
The overload.
And
Yeah.
yep, sensory overload. And she completely melted down, ran out of the room. Took a lot of coaxing to get her back in the room. She didn't want to open her presents. And it was really quite distressing to watch, because I was like, what is going on here? I really couldn't understand it. And then I started to notice that every time we went out, and it'd be a case of, okay, what would you like to eat? And she would just clam up, she'd close up, she'd physically kind of shrink into herself. And the more that I kind of got frustrated and prodded her to kind of give me some kind of choice, because too much choice, and she
Yes.
can't deal with too much choice, she would retreat even further within herself.
Okay.
And it would then, it would play out into this, because I didn't understand what was going on. And then I would get frustrated because I just didn't understand it. And then when I started to think back and go, God, I used to do that. And then took me back to how I felt when my mother did that to me. And then I was like, oh my God, this is horrible. I've got
It's
to stop
almost
doing
history
that, right?
repeating. Almost history
Yeah,
repeating itself.
because it's a
Absolutely.
trauma, right?
It is.
There's a trauma that's associated with it. And I've been reading a lot of Gabor Mate at the moment. His book on how
Fantastic.
trauma and all of that sort of is linked up, and it's not all separate, siloed behaviors and things. So yeah, I really started to realize, oh my goodness, what have I done to her? Have I made it worse? And I did raise it a few times. I mean, she was at nursery, and when she was at school, they used to say, well, she's just a bit shy. She just needs a bit more confidence in herself, but she's fine in her small groups of trusted friends. She's fine with the teachers. She communicates well. She doesn't have a problem with communication. It's more that if she feels overwhelmed, she might retreat a bit. But, you know, she was top 1%, you know, in terms of her academic level. So it was these little moments as a child, a young, you know, sort of that just started to kind of build up. And then obviously COVID, they went into being at home, and she really wanted to be at school. And she was like, I want to be in school learning. I don't want to be doing it online. Why can't I just be in school? And then she started to get used to being behind, you know, not having any visibility of anyone. And I think that allowed her then to drop all the masking that had been going on and just go, my God, the school environment is overwhelming. So that when she went back into the school environment, she couldn't deal with all the sound. And consequently, we found out now that her triggers are auditory. So it's a lot of the noise. Sometimes it can be lights. She prefers certain lights. And she just feels like everything is going very fast in her head, and she needs everything to go faster. But because it doesn't go fast enough, she then switches off and she loses interest. And she has to have a phone or something in her hand to kind of bring her back. And people think she's being rude or she's not paying attention. But if she's got a phone in her hand, she can focus and listen. Or if you're walking, you go for a walk, she'll start to open up with you. Whereas if you are face on to her and trying to talk through things, she just closes down.
She'll close down because she feels
pressure.
threatened and overwhelmed by that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I really recognized that when I was younger. Now, not so much. Definitely not so much now. But yeah, there's all these kind of little things, and you start to build the picture. You've got all these puzzle pieces, and you can't quite see where the corners are and how you can make a picture out of it. And then it all just started to slot together. But unfortunately, she does have the complexity of the selective mutism in there. And then I relate that back to some trauma in her sort of very early infant days relating to me and how my ADHD played out in a particular scenario. But we can get on to that one. But so, you know, it was challenging to watch this very bubbly, very funny little girl suddenly kind of retreat into herself. And she literally didn't speak to me for about 2 weeks when things got to the escalation point. Just over 2 years ago. And it was, you know, teachers going, it's bad behavior. I'm like, she's always been the perfect student. She's not rebelling at home. Why would she be rebelling at school unless something's happened in school? Or if it's something else. And I really had to go into battle with the school to get them they'd excluded her for a few days. There was a whole big thing. And I had to go to the governors. And the governors agreed and just turned around and went, you're just not doing enough. This is clearly not behaviour. You need to start thinking about how you can get the educational needs department involved and getting some assessments done and things like that. So, yeah, it did take sort of me donning my Joan of Arc banner and going into battle for my daughter just to get it heard correctly, because, you know, it's just not there for girls.
So let me ask you, there's two questions that really come out of this, right? Oh, there's a few, but let's just focus for a second, and I'll come back to the other 2 points because they're very relevant. Over the last couple of months, I've learned a huge amount about ADHD, not just for myself, because I've had it all my life and diagnosed at 43. But what's very interesting is how different ADHD and all of its traits, and the one that you've mentioned a lot there was selective mutism, but also sensory processing disorder, and we more know the term autism and ADHD itself and how it presents itself. But in women, in girls, in females, it presents itself it internalizes itself a
Yeah,
lot more than it does
absolutely.
in boys and men. Boys are just naughty with ADHD, right?
They're
That was the
jumping around
term.
all over the place, right? They're hyper.
Flailing, it's, oh my God, what's going on?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm not
bouncing
listening.
off the walls.
Yeah, exactly. Or the phrase I like to use is roller skating off the ceiling, right?
Oh, I love it.
but what I'm very interested in, you've talked about being a parent with your own ADHD, which is challenging enough in itself,
Mm,
with a daughter as well who has ADHD. And you're right. The two of those must spark at some point,
mm,
because we all know about the prefrontal cortex, our emotional control. I'm as high as a kite 1 minute. I'm as low as, a graveyard the next. And
yeah.
that's very difficult as a parent, to manage that emotional regularity when you
Mm,
have a child who, latterly will be going through puberty, or, the challenges of just growing up, and
absolutely.
being a woman as well.
Yeah,
That's
those
that.
changes. It's so prolific because, you know, there were moments where she's always found it difficult talking about her emotions, and she's been very internalized and never really understood that, when she was very young. And then the more and more I started to read about ADHD, then going connecting the dots, and then finding out, actually, yes, I do have it too. And then it's like, oh wow, put so much into perspective of my whole life of feeling slightly different, slightly disconnected. I'm very in touch with my emotions now, but there would be times, like you say, where I could be very hyper, very exuberant, and people going, "Oh, you've got so much energy and you're so confident," and I'm like, mm-mm, mm-mm. There's the other side, whereby I just need to be in hibernation, away from everyone. I don't want to talk for weeks and weeks, and I just want to be in my little bubble, and I'm happy to be in that bubble because I want to go down a little dark hole for a while, right?
I'm there.
and
I
and
share it.
and
I get it. I'm there.
yeah, yeah. And I'm sure that's why I was a goth, probably, was because it just played up to that part of me, right?
What a great masking technique. Being a goth is the best mask, right?
Absolutely, because also you're putting a barrier up, because thinking about it, I was the only goth in the village, right? And
Yeah.
everyone used to make a big deal about it, but then they kept their distance. And so it's like, I feel different. I don't want to be like everyone else because you've made me feel like I'm different. So I'm going to play up being different even more. So I'm
Yeah.
going to go to the extreme, which then pushes people away. And I want to push people away because I don't feel like you've been able to try and understand me or accept me as I am. So
Yeah.
therefore, kind of two fingers up to you, here's another
Yeah.
barrier to get past.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Absolutely.
um but yeah, I think, the whole thing of the way, we know that the diagnosis for ADHD for the last 50 years has been based on how boys are diagnosed, right? And they
That's
haven't
right.
actually updated and looked at creating a new way of testing girls. Hey, they really need to get onto that, right? That's a really big thing. And I think I was watching one of your other guests talking about the education system. I think it was Annie. And I'm like, not just there, absolutely here in the UK, the education system is not a fit for purpose for those with any kind of neuroability, neurodiversity, right? The environment, children having to be expected to sit there for an hour and a half in a class when you know that your brain can only take in information for like 15, 20 minutes, and that you need to have a break. So why are we teaching in these big blocks of time? Why are we
Yes.
starting so early in the day when we know that teenage brains need longer to sleep? They need not to start until a bit later in the day. You can tell I've done a lot of research.
Yeah, but
And
this is great because Astrid, listening to you talk, the way you're coming across to the audience that are going to listen to this is extremely important, right? It's so valuable when somebody like yourself, who has such a fascinating story, has to go by themselves, because, and I wouldn't be diminishing, any country in the world as they go through their learning processes with the government. Annie, by the way, she's from New Zealand. She had a very specific situation herself with her own children, and the very young prime minister in New Zealand had ploughed millions into the healthcare system around supporting neurodiversity. And then when Jacinta Ardern, I think her name was,
Yes.
she then left office and that money was pulled. And there has been a very big impact on the benefits that brought at the time and how that's gone away, which is a real shame, actually. But Annie's a great story, right? A great story. And it's nice to talk to people in other countries as well. You know, I live in Ireland, as you know, and you're there in the UK. Tell me a bit more about the system. And I don't want to make it about grey men in suits, right, in the
Sure.
government that charge it up. But, you know,
It
when you
kind
go
of
to your
is.
GP, but when you go to your GP or you go to the school and you say, look, you know, there's special education needs here, you know, or there's a need to create an environment for my child that's very important so that they can continue to function. How does that work in the UK or in your experience?
In my experience, and it was magnified as being very difficult to navigate because of my own ADHD, right? Because we know we like to procrastinate. The things that are those activities that just don't interest us or are very difficult to get our brains working in the right way and sign that task, trying to navigate that whole system really fed into those aspects of my ADHD. And so it was really hard going, shit, I've got to do all this for my daughter, but this is really overwhelming for me.
Yes.
So initially it was, like I say, initially it was really battling up against the school and going, look, this isn't behavior. There's something else going on. She was very depressed at the time as well and feeling suicidal, which is natural, right? Because
Yes.
she's been functioning in her mind normally for years and years. And then here she's back in school for nearly 2 terms and the start of her year 10, a really crucial point, right? And a couple of weeks in, 6 weeks in, she's in meltdown and completely coming away at the seams,
Yes.
right? So then she was suicidal. So that was where kind of we had an incident where she ended up out all night, and she doesn't go out at night, and she was out all night with a friend, and she was putting herself in a risky situation because of the way everything was spiraling out of control. And I had to report her missing to the police. It was quite stressful, and her brother at the time was in the police, so it was all very bizarre.
Okay.
But, you know, I laugh about it now just because, you know, when you kind of look back, you go, gosh, yeah, okay. But, you know, it was a case of then going to the GP and GP going, well, she's got depression. I'm like, but there's something else going on here, right? And luckily, the GP that she spoke to was very supportive. She was female. She could see that it was in part kind of linked to that post-COVID, you know, time. And she was like, well, let's look into this a bit more. Let's get you some support. And so she did a referral to so Camden Local Council is very overwhelmed with mental health problems, partly because it's in a part of London that has always been notorious for drug taking, and so there's a lot of very unwell people, not just because of that, but there's a lot of mental health, you know, issues going on within Camden Council. We have quite a high number of, you know, homeless people and all these other challenges, health challenges. So I already knew that accessing mental health services in Camden was going to be a bit of a battle.
Yes.
And I have to say, from a friend whose daughter had been through some similarities, not neurodiversity, but just depression and trying to get mental health support, I knew that it's something that you've got to understand the system, or you've got to know how to get the right help from the system, and that it is very challenging. So that was kind of the first hurdle I was looking at and going, oh my gosh, am I equipped to be able to do this? But then I'm always very good in a crisis.
ADHD crisis management, right?
ADHD
The best.
crisis, which is why my previous career was the perfect career for me, because it fed my dopamine and being able to, respond to a crisis. So it was initially those early days, it was quite easy to kind of just kick in and do all the things I needed to do, but it was not in a way that I understood the navigation of the system. So the GP did a referral to the it's called CAMS, so Camden Mental Health Service, and they're all interlinked. And we got an appointment at the Tavistock and Portman Hospital in our area, which is very well known in England for dealing with mental health. It's had a lot of criticism as well about the handling of autism quite recently, which I didn't know at the time, obviously. And so we had an appointment. We saw a couple of different people there. We had like a family therapist who was trying to assess what was the best kind of treatment. And because she would be closed down in those meetings, and I would have to be her voice. And I learned very quickly how to interpret her nonverbal language.
Okay.
So, there were certain things like she shrugs so if you ask her yes or no, she won't reply yes or no. But a shrug it's more likely to be a yes. If she rolls her eyes and looks really like, what are you talking about? That's a no. So there were all these kind of little cues. And I started to almost very intuitively understand what was going on in her head, just from a few little things that she might say in those golden moments when she would open up. But in those sessions, they were very painful, because I felt like I was talking for her, but I didn't know 100% that's what I needed to say in order to get the right help. And so we had a lot of back and forth. We were going for certain meetings and didn't quite get there. Whilst at the same time, the school educational needs support teacher was trying to put things in place. Post-COVID, the school she's at, in a very affluent area, because it and so very affluent area, girls' school, and their motto was happy, healthy girls. So they kind of wanted to keep it all a little bit closed off and under the radar. So they had kind of invested in putting a lot of things in place. And so we were able to get a speech and language therapy assessment done. That was through the Whittington Hospital, which is also just around the corner, the local hospital in North London. And that's where they identified situational or selective mutism. And then out of that, when I started research, I was like, well, isn't that linked to ADHD? Isn't that linked to autism? Should we be looking to get an autism assessment or an ADHD assessment? And in the meantime, because of all me feeling overwhelmed about everything I had to battle, and meeting with the governors, getting the school to put the right things in place, having a plan for her, and then trying to get the right CAMS support, it was very much a case of, oh my gosh, I was burnt out, and I was trying to keep my job going. I'm a management consultant. That can be intense. My other two children, and just trying to juggle it all. And I was like, my God, this is a time where you really recognize, if you don't have a support system, like not having a partner, not having your parents around, or extended family, which, I was only really close with my dad, I'm an only child, don't have any extended family. So it's very like, I'm alone in this. And not long before, my closest friends that had lived nearby had moved back to Europe. So I also didn't have that right on the doorstep anymore
either. Wow.
So I did really feel like, oh my, how am I going to get her through this? And at the same time, make sure
yourself as well.
Yeah. And how do I come to terms with it? And I have to say, my work was absolutely amazing. The company I was working for at the time, they gave me like compassionate leave. I had a few weeks off where I could just spend some time to work out putting all the plan in place and doing those conversations. I got from CAMS, I managed to get a sort of educational support worker, which was there to be Lucia's advocate, her voice when dealing with the school. So he would come along to the meetings we'd have with the school, the meeting we had with the governors. So he was there to support me. What did I need? Helping me sort of maybe work through some of the conversations I needed to have with Lucia in order to best represent her
interests.
Because she wouldn't open up to him. He came for about 3 months, and not once did she engage with him. She wouldn't even look up at him, or there were all these kind of things going on. So yeah, it took a year and a half before we really started to get the right therapist. We never got a formal autism assessment. We put in for 2 requests through the school. The first one, the SENDCO had completely misrepresented everything I had said, because we went right back to her childhood. There were a lot of things that were captured incorrectly, or things that weren't captured from our conversation. So then that got sent back from the health authority saying she doesn't meet the criteria. And I was just pulling my hair out going, she does. I'm sorry. I'm looking at some of these things and I'm like, she does. Or at least test her, right? And then we put in a second request. But I never actually saw what the SENDCO put in. I only ever saw what came back from the health authority in relation to it. And I was like, is this what she submitted? Because that's not what we discussed. So she got turned down twice to have an autism assessment through NHS.
Let me pause there for a second, okay? Because what I want to understand here is there are 2 challenges that I see being faced in the UK and everywhere, right? I mean, here in Ireland, similar challenges, and in fact, I'll go as far as to say Ireland is probably not as advanced in neurodiverse understandings from a society perspective as maybe the US is, or indeed the UK. But there's obviously the challenge of getting through the system, okay, which is if you've broken a bone, there's still a challenge getting through the system, right? But the second challenge is the knowledge of how to identify, triage, and test these conditions in individuals, right? And there's a lot of people out there. There's a big proportion of the population, and you quite rightly said, when it comes to women, females, girls, that test is very different. The exhibition of behaviors is very different. And then you've got these submodalities of, as you say, selective mutism or sensory processing disorder or whatever, inattentive aspects of ADHD. But do you feel, so while we put the navigation aspect of the system to one side, and like anywhere in the world, I think it's a postcode lottery whether you get the right place with the right people and so on and so forth. But your experience of when you reached that point and you got to the people, did they really have the knowledge and understanding and the training, the background to be able to do that assessment correctly?
No, definitely not. Because, one of the things was my daughter, so Lucia managed to get a sort of psychotherapist, and the first psychotherapist she started to build up quite a good relationship with, but then that was only introductory sessions while she was waiting for the proper psychotherapist to be sort of like assigned to her. Which I was like, well, hang on, why is it happening like that? And she then got this second psychotherapist, and she said, she's so inexperienced, she's really young. And I was like, well, I would have thought you might want someone younger so that maybe you could relate to that person maybe a little bit better. But actually, for her, that felt like they don't have enough experience. And I have to add, she can be a little bit arrogant at times because she's a smart girl. And
she's smart. Yeah, of course.
She's smart. And she's like, who are these stupid people? And that's the way she is, right? But she was like, this person's experience. And after about 10 sessions, she was like, I just don't want to continue with this therapist. I don't feel I can open up to them. I just don't feel they've got enough knowledge. And I was like, okay. And to be fair, she was having CBT, and equally we're like, CBT is not the right therapy for this, right? Certainly
No.
not for selective mutism, because
No.
it's not a conscious behavior or even a subconscious behavior. There's fight, flight, freeze. She's in complete freeze mode.
Shut down. Complete shutdown. Absolutely.
Because her
There's no
senses
brain.
are overwhelmed, and
Yeah.
she can't. Her brain can't process everything. It's all this
Absolutely.
sensory processing, as you said, and all these other things that are going off in her brain, and trauma being released as well. So of course you're going to shut down. And then she got assigned another therapist that was meant to be a proper just psychotherapist, and it was supposed to be more down the sort of traditional psychiatry route of talking therapy.
Yes.
And she was a little bit older, and 3 sessions she was like, I do not want to continue with therapy. She's like, the woman just sits there and goes, I feel like you don't want to talk to me, you don't want to be here. She's like, she's not posing any questions to me to get me to try and communicate with her. And I was actually very surprised by that, because I'm thinking, well, with the selective mutism, she's not going to want to do that, right? But actually, she wants a proper psychiatrist, is what she wants. So now we're going down the route of, we've pulled away from all the local health authority support, and said, actually, she wants to go to a private therapist, and we found 2 options nearby. And that's what we're looking into, a proper sort of psychiatrist, because that's what she feels she wants. But it's taken just over 2 years to get to this point.
Yeah.
And that she hasn't even had a formal. And then we've gone, well, do you want to have an autism diagnosis? Do you want to have that formal autism diagnosis? You've got this one, but do you want to go down this route? And at the moment, we've just decided not to for the moment. But I've said, at any point you change your mind, then we can always do that, or you can do that as an adult. But she doesn't want to be labelled. That's fine. That's her choice. And
that's interesting. Yeah. You're right. I see a coach therapist myself, but that person is based in the United States because they specialize in ADHD. Right.
Yeah.
And what I actually found was there's a very different approach to talking to me if somebody has experience working with ADHD than if they don't. And I'm no expert. I'm certainly not a medical expert. And like anybody listening to this, this is not testament to, the good and the bad of public healthcare systems around the world. It is, people's individual stories of their own experiences and challenges that they face as they bring up children, their own neurodiversity, and the maturity level of countries around the world, and how it can be improved, through government policy, training, understanding, and I think Aestrid, what's actually happening is it's coming through from the bottom up actually now, because people with their own sense of neurodiversity are doing their own research, like you so well have. And while you don't have all the answers, in the absence of anything else, you're doing your very best to get there, right? And that's hugely challenging. I mean,
we shouldn't have to, right? We should be able to expect that our education system and our healthcare system and the policymakers, are looking at this in a holistic way, but it's all very piecemeal, right? And again, it comes down to this thing of, I'd have so many times where people would say, oh, it's a mental health condition. And I'd be like, it's not in the way of what you're thinking as mental health, right? Yes, our brain is not separate. It's the biggest organ in our body, and it controls everything in our body. And, if something's not working, it's probably because it all stems from our brain initially, and it's all interconnected. But we treat it almost like, here's your mental health, here's your physical health. And like, these are separate entities. And it's not, it's interconnected.
Very much.
And that's then replicated across the systems we're having to engage with, the different services we're having to try and navigate and engage with and get the right support. And so everything just kind of sits in these little silos, and you're never quite sure who's talking to who and whether they are or not. And so, there is no, if you could have a pot of money attributed to you to use in whatever way across the services in order to, whether it's to access diagnosis, right? Whether it's, to get the right therapy, whether it's to get certain, things that can support you in school, all these kind of, accommodations made for you or whatever, then wouldn't this be a better way of being able to access all the right things and make sure that everyone is getting exactly what they need in order to live their best life within a society? But maybe I won't go down this rabbit hole, because for me, I feel very much like society wants us to be in these different camps, right? You are neurodiverse. You are different. You are not normal. But there is no such thing as normal. Well, Marte's, talking about that. There is no normal. It's all these, state apparatus and the state structures and systems that we've got. And again, this maybe is a little bit subversive, but, it comes back to a misogynistic society that only wants to consider men and men's health and the world of the male. And
Agreed.
the female has to make do with a male assessment, or being called, if we go back to Victorian times where we would be told we were hysterical, right? And all these kind of different terminologies. And again, it's all to support the misogynistic society and these structures and maintain that power balance, right? And probably
I agree.
It's a little bit like, oh, that's a little bit, but that's how I feel, because it's so hard for girls and women to get, how many women now are getting diagnosed in their 40s and 50s? Yes. They've gone through a whole life, brought up their children, had their careers, been out in the world, and now you'll find it. And then you go, now all of this makes sense.
Now I get absolutely.
Now I feel validated. Yes. But then you're only validated so far, because even the assessment isn't validating you as a woman with ADHD. It's validating you as having ADHD based on how it presents within a male. Yes. So how is that an even playing field to begin with?
Agreed.
And so for me, it's like the policymakers, those in these positions of power, need to understand what they're doing to women, across different levels. It's not just one level, it's a multitude of levels, and it goes deep. And then for us, it becomes even more overpowering and overwhelming to try and break through the system in order to get what we need to get.
I agree, actually. Can we start talking about, because you'd alluded earlier on to a very interesting subject that a previous guest by the name of the wonderful Katie Friedman, who is in the UK, doesn't not too far away from your good self, actually. Mm-hmm. And Katie she has ADHD herself. She calls her ADHD Tiger, which I think is brilliant. And you can see the facial expression change, and it's like these wild eyes of Tigger as she starts to bounce. And Katie, I love you, by the way, and I really respect the work you're doing with GoldMinds and all of that. But Katie explained to me that the way they're working with ADHD in GoldMinds, and you can look this up afterwards, watch the episode, and then I'll put you in touch with Katie. But she said, we heal trauma first, then we deal with the neurodiverse condition, because there's trauma. You mentioned that earlier on, right at the beginning. Talk to me about that, right? And does that kind of thinking make sense? I don't know. I think it does, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough one, right? Because for me on my own journey, I've realized for me, it was very hard to disconnect the trauma and the condition, right? And I know some people, for them, they feel, there's this, there's the positive language around ADHD and saying, it's not a challenge, it makes me a superhero. Unfortunately for me, I don't feel that any form at all. I don't feel there's any superhero part of it for me. It is really debilitating when I'm at my worst. Even when I'm on a good day, it's still pretty debilitating to a certain extent. So to me, it is intertwined and interconnected with my trauma because it's so deep rooted and such an early stage of my life. When I look back and I go, yeah, okay, so all these ADHD sort of traits that played out, and that's all I can remember from an early age, looking back, knowing what they are now, right? So with my daughter, I think probably maybe I don't know what her experience is and how she feels because she doesn't really remember a lot from when she was younger, which again, then I'm like, that's because you're in the trauma cycle and you haven't accessed it yet, because I know what the trauma is, because and I'm happy to talk about this. So for me, I had come out of a career that was extremely dangerous, put me in a lot of very near death situations, and I came out of it with PTSD. I came out of it with a breakdown, and I was pregnant with my daughter at the time when I was kind of coming out of that. And when she was only a month old, I was at the height of my breakdown, and my ADHD was making it worse, right? Or maybe it was making the ADHD worse. I don't quite know, but
together it was exacerbating it, right?
Absolutely. And I was definitely not functioning, and to the extent whereby I disappeared for a couple of days, to the point where helicopters were up and it was all guns blaring, and she was a baby, right? She was only like a month old. And the blame and guilt part of having ADHD kicked in. And then when they started delving into my daughter's kind of younger years, then they're like, well, did she ever have this? Did she ever have that? And then I was like, oh God. And I'm thinking, is all of this the trauma that triggered like the selective mutism and all of this? Because, and then particularly reading the stuff I'm reading at the moment is like, it could be, right? But we know it doesn't cause the ADHD, but it is, I guess it's a symptom. It can be seen as a symptom of the root cause that sits within us, right? If our brains and our neurological pathways and everything aren't quite working in the way the normal society would like them to work and expect them to work, because it's more about our brains work differently in certain environments. Therefore, if that environment has had an impact with the trauma, has that then almost kind of sparked it becoming the ADHD becoming worse, or has it sparked it coming into life? Well, no, it was always there, but maybe it sparked it becoming noticeable that it's there. So it's a really strange thing when you start trying to kind of decompose it all and make sense of whether it's linked, not linked, how it all fits together. But for me, in my own experience, it was definitely, a major link. I can't talk for my daughter because we haven't discussed it.
No,
But
of course.
for me, there's always this element of, obviously mother guilt. You have that regardless.
That's there anyway,
It goes
right?
with being a parent, right?
Am I a bad dad, by the way? I ask myself that question regularly. Can I just say this, though, right? I just want to pause for a second, and I want to say this. I think, and I've known you for a long time, and I think when you say, even on a good day, I'm not, You bloody are. Okay. And I look, the purpose of this podcast is to dive into the subject matter of ADHD and neurodiversity, but it's also to celebrate the extraordinary minds of those with ADHD. And you have a wonderful brain, right? Somebody who can bring up children on their own, having come from an extremely dangerous past, right? To do what you're doing now and to continue to function and to tell the story that you're telling today is incredible, right? And I just want to level that for you for a second, because it's very important to everybody out there to listen. And if you catch me on a bad day, I can't do anything. I can't even read text or do simple maths, right? And you catch me on a good day and I feel like I'm a god, right? And I've caught you on good days in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying I don't have, I know that I've got certain things that I'm strength. I know I can handle crisis, of the biggest magnitude. Let's face it, life or death. And that's what I always found really hard once I really knew I had ADHD, and I was like, hang on, but wouldn't you think that doing this very dangerous career, that how can you do that? And have ADHD? Well, no, because it was so high paced, and there was always lots of different things going on at the same time.
Yes.
And it was very niche in terms of what I was doing, that it fed my dopamine, right?
Of course.
So the
it's
dopamine
huge.
rush was magnified. So then I realized that once I left that and then started going into a more mainstream way of living life and working, that those highs and lows were much bigger, right?
Yes.
So there was these huge peaks and troughs. Like I could work really long hours and then suddenly be sort of like, in that hyper focus and very creative. And then there'd be times where I just was like exhausted and I just couldn't work out what the task was I needed to do, right?
Yeah.
And then going into things of where I was, I guess, to a certain degree, self-medicating, because then I'd be going out partying a lot, drinking a lot, that kind of thing. That was my thing. I wasn't an alcoholic, but I knew when I look back and I go, yeah, okay, that was all part of those two kind of extremes. And so it took me a few years to get into the right sort of job where I could still feed some of that and I guess make the most of those skills, but give me a good equilibrium when things are good. But when things are bad, it still really kicks in, and it's been quite bad recently. And that's because I've felt under stress. I changed my job and there's other factors. And so and then I look at the arc and I go, that's why that worked, because it just really fed my what my brain needed. And so then I go, okay, that makes sense. So yeah, I do know, there's things that I am very creative, but then I've got so many projects I'd like to do that I started and that I just haven't managed to kind of get to any kind of completion, So
I know that I'm constantly in trouble at home from my wife because of all these unfinished projects everywhere.
My fridge is not the place you want to go, because like I'll buy stuff and then I'll I'm going to cook that, I'm going to make that, I'm going to do some baking this weekend, and then I go in the fridge, or my older daughter comes home at the when she comes home from the army every sort of couple of months, and she'll go, oh my gosh, and she'll just have to go through and throw loads
and just
of things
empty the
out.
fridge out of that stuff that you haven't touched, right?
Like, why is the kitchen smelling? Oh yes, that's because there's some half-cooked eggs or something in here that have been here for the last 2 months. You must throw it out.
You need to hold on to those, right? You need to hold on to those.
She needs it. She said,
exactly.
Am I a doomsdayer? She was like, are you a doomsdayer? Look at all these tins you've got in here from about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, actually pre-COVID. And she was like, they've now gone out of date, and these things never go out of date. And I was like,
I love it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I know that one. Aestrid, let's talk about medication. So if you don't mind me asking, do you medicate yourself?
I do not, because because I'm part of who I am and how I want to live my life. I don't really like taking medication.
Okay.
I don't. God, it sounds like I'm a bit of a nutcase, doesn't it? I don't really, I don't really trust the healthcare system, particularly after, I guess, seeing like the American healthcare system and just kind of pill popping, right? And so for
Big
me,
pharma, right?
big
Yeah, I get it.
pharma, yeah, big
Yeah, I
pharma.
understand.
So, and I've always been down the route of being very natural. I've noticed over the years that pharmaceuticals don't always work very well for me, that more natural remedies work for me. And so I went through a period of being very careful about my diet and sort of using things that were very natural, herbal. And then as I got into management consultancy and my life got a little bit more fast paced, and I started kind of, doing all the things that I felt I hadn't done after leaving my previous career and having a bit of a hiatus and going, oh, I need to make up for all this lost time. So I've kind of I have times where I get into a bit of a bad cycle. And
Okay.
obviously with my dad passing away, I've been in that bad cycle because I've
Yeah.
kind of let a lot of things slip. And so that's part of the reason that I know now that at the moment and for the last couple of months, probably not at my best, and that I should try and get back to my routine. But then it seems very overwhelming at the moment. So
But
I don't take
rightly so.
medication.
Yeah, no, and it's a great answer. But and by the way, the stresses of life, and losing anyone is whether ADHD or not, changes in major events that happen in one's life have an impact upon everybody, right? When my father passed away, the same. And there are days when and that was a number of years ago. And there are days when you think to yourself, my God, and it's troublesome. What's very interesting is I've had a number of guests on here who have some choose to medicate, some choose not to, some choose meditation. That's never worked for me, but it does for
Yes,
some.
same. I can't switch off enough. I can't switch that internal voice off enough to meditate.
No,
I don't understand people that can do
no.
meditation because I'm like, well, how do you get the voice in your
How,
head to shut up?
yeah, exactly. How does all that 95 channels all at the same time disappear? Right?
Yeah,
Where does that go?
yeah.
I've had people who swear by lion's mane mushrooms.
I had been considering doing that, and then I was like, oh, I don't know, and so again, it's like I'm always really conscious both of things like that and pharma on how it's going to react on my actual body. And so
Yeah,
that's what always puts me off because I'm just like, how do I know how I'm going to react? And what if it's a horrible reaction? And then I've got to work out what I do with that. So a
agreed.
lot of fear plays into me
Yeah,
trying things, which is not great either, because
yeah.
there could be something out there that would really help me. Um,
Well, I
and
had
it's about,
what one thing that came up recently, and it's kind of something that you may have seen out there, but I had a DNA test done last year,
mm,
and there's a particular gene. There's 5 of them, but there's one particular gene, right, called MTHFR. I don't know if you've heard of this or
I
not.
have heard of it.
And if there's a kind of a slight change to that particular gene, and it's called a methylation DNA test. Now, I've looked in behind the scenes at some of the research on this, and there's
Mm,
marginal research, right? So you have to be careful because Big
yeah.
Pharma deals on, peer-based research, and I have a
Yep.
similar issue that you do. But what's very interesting about that is if you do have that gene mutation, there is a link to ADHD, right?
Mm,
Okay, thank you. That's tick. And then taking something called methylfolate, not folic acid that women take when they're pregnant, but
yep.
methylfolate that you can pick up in Holland and Barrett and so on and so forth. The research on the 5,000 people that there was research on shows that there is increased blood flow to the prefrontal cortex in the brain as a result of taking it after 2 weeks.
Mm,
And the anxiety that increases homocysteine in the body as well, and
hmm
raises blood pressure from that anxiety is also reduced. So there's a couple of physical things there, and I think, okay, that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
I get that. I do medicate myself, right? I'll
Mm.
say this. I say this because there is a proportion of the population. So I spent 12 years taking Ritalin,
Mm.
and recently I've switched actually out of some learnings to something called Tyvens, and in the UK it's called something different, which is this
Mm.
is the amphetamine, and this is the methylphenidate. Now, we grew up in, this is
Amphetamines.
speed.
Give me
This is speed.
amphetamines. If you give me
Yeah,
amphetamines, my God, like my hyper puppy when I'm on my up anyway, which you've seen my hyper puppy, what that can be like. Can
yeah.
you imagine if I'm like, that would be interesting.
But interesting for me, it has a reverse effect, which
That's
is interesting.
interesting. Which
So
is
when
like for
I
me with coffee, right? So like some people with ADHD find if they have too much coffee or they have coffee, that it kind of puts them to sleep, right?
yeah,
And then it's just like kind of lowers them instead of making them a bit more. Whereas with me, it gets me to a good equilibrium. So that's
yes.
kind of my medication is coffee. I can't overdo it, but if I don't have quite enough, then I'm just like, I'm not there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And do you know, it's funny. Somebody else says, nicotine toothpicks. So everybody associates nicotine with smoking, obviously, and smoking
Yeah.
is very bad for you. But actually, you can get these nicotine toothpicks, and the delivery of, I think it's like 6 milligrams of nicotine, is actually enough of a stimulant to get that brain working as well, which is very
Mm.
interesting. So again,
Mm.
I can't meditate, and the first guy who came on the podcast, actually, a wonderful gentleman in he's an animator, and he said, George, half of the film and television industry have ADHD or some
Yeah.
part thereof, right?
Absolutely.
Of course, it makes sense,
Yeah.
but he said, yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense. Storytelling, right? Teletubbies. Think about it for a second, right? It's like, where did that story come from? And he said that he signed up to a course of meditation, and now he is 85 channels deep, this guy, right? I
Mm,
mean, he's
mm,
Andy Kavanagh. Love you, man, and thank you for helping me get started. He went off to an island off the west coast of Ireland and said,
mhm,
for 3 days he sat there cross-legged and couldn't get his brain into that meditative state. And about an
mm.
hour before they were about to leave to come back to, the mainland, Ireland, he said all of a sudden his brain just went and switched off. And he
Oh my
said,
God. I
he said, but
can't
it took
imagine
him,
what that must be like.
and he said, I can now reach that state regularly. And I said, oh man,
Mm.
I must go to, it's the Aran Islands or somewhere like that, right?
Oh,
Where
that
this
sounds
group
ideal.
did.
See, I want to go off to like the Isle of Skye, somewhere like that, really remote, just a little island on my own, hibernate for like the winter. Because
Yeah,
I think for me, being out in nature really helps me. I don't completely shut off that goddamn voice in my head. And then it sounds like, oh God, am I schizophrenic? But no, there is only one voice. Um, but it is very much this thing of you've got all these tabs open. For me, it's like tabs of the library. Everything's being thrown around in the library at the back of my brain, which is like the more stuff that comes in, everything just goes, stuff has to move backwards and backwards and backwards to the back of the library. And then there's these tabs opening and it's all like, and I'm just like, oh my God, just like, shut up, some quiet, right?
please. Yes.
Yeah. And the only time for me that really happens is when I'm out in nature. And I'm completely on my own. I can just tune into whatever that environment is. And then I started to piece it together because, all the things that really make me feel connected to myself, where I can be my true authentic self, is related to nature. And that was all the things that my dad had taught me and taken me to, the great Midwest of the US where we spent a lot of time. And there's these environments that are embedded in my brain. When I'm in the UK, there's certain environments in the UK that I just like, oh, I feel at home now, and then I can relax and everything falls away.
Yes.
And whilst everything doesn't, it doesn't completely shut down and go quiet, I can get to a point where it feels enough of a peaceful quiet that I can deal with it. So yeah, the idea of being able to just go off somewhere, and which I know some people find is absolutely frightening, but I'm very happy on my own and just having nothing around me, because I think that's sometimes my brain going, that's where you can truly connect to yourself and what goes on inside yourself in order to get to some kind of, level where it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree with you there completely. I think that somebody said about, we don't actually touch the earth these days. We're in
Mm-hmm.
false environments, concrete,
Mm,
especially in the city, where you
mm,
live, as well, and me here in Dublin as well. I find that doing cold water bathing, which is very, in the
yes.
in the,
Well,
the mode
see,
at the
I
moment.
can't swim, but getting in a
Yeah,
cold shower or going out into the real cold, like on a really cold, winter's day, if I've got
yeah,
like, because I get a lot of headaches because of my ADHD, and if I
yeah,
go out into the cold, immediately it just really helps how I feel.
yeah, very much. And actually, a mixture of sauna and ice bath, and we're
Mm,
fortunate we've got a place just down here where you can jump in the sea and then jump in the sauna for virtually no money, and that I get that peace of mind from that personally. So
mm.
it is very interesting.
I do
Tell
think some
me,
of it is linked to the primal instinct, though. So for me, I feel that it's, we say about environment, right, and the society we live in and everything, and I think that really does have a contribution, because we live in such an artificial society now.
we
So
do,
if you think back to our more primal selves, where we were, I won't maybe go as far back as saying like in our caveman days, but where life was a lot more simple. We didn't have all these distractions. Our time and our brains are being pulled in so many different directions with different media, social media. We've always got to be busy. We're expected to be great and doing everything and constantly busy and hard at work. And if you don't do that, and all these kind of demands on our mind, it doesn't enable our bodies and our mind to fully get in touch with the primal person that we are and how we've evolved over the years in order to kind of get back to that authentic self. That's how I feel. And that's,
yeah.
I think, where some of that comes from.
I think so too. And actually, there's a study done recently that I was reading about in 1970, when families got up in the morning. They sat and maybe had breakfast together, and dad went to work, and maybe mum stayed at home, or went to work, and kids went to school. And then they came home and they had a dinner together. In that 24-hour period in 1970, there was about 100 pieces of information going into their brains per day.
Mm.
Fast forward to 2020, there was 100,000 pieces of information going into somebody's brain. No wonder mental health's an
Yeah,
issue. No
yeah,
wonder ADHD is
yeah,
exacerbated beyond belief, right? No
of
wonder
course.
your daughter feels overwhelmed and
Yeah,
shuts down. Too
yeah.
much information, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. Our brains need, and that's like, it links into the whole thing of like Alzheimer's, right? That if you don't get enough sleep, they've done a lot of studies recently, haven't they, about the plaque that builds up on your brain. And that if
Yes.
you need to have that thing of having, shorter bursts of meetings and things like that, you need those 20-minute slots or whatever. And you need to sort of have a little bit of a break between the things you're doing so that your brain can process it. Well, going to sleep is the ultimate processing. Our brain, it's, like having a computer, that central core processing unit is not going to work properly if it's constantly on the go and never shuts down. That's what sleep is. And if you don't get enough of that, it all builds up in this plaque, and then it can lead to, having dementia and Alzheimer's. We know that's from the studies they're doing now. That's one of the contributing factors. So when you think about it, like you say, there's no wonder there's all these things going on now in society, and everyone go, well, we never used to have this in our day. Well, you didn't
You
maybe have
didn't.
it to the
Yeah.
extent that you have it now. It was there, but not to the extent, because people weren't living such, like you say, information overload and all these other contributory factors that
Yeah.
just really don't give our brains enough time to shut down, relax, rejuvenate, recharge, which is why somebody with ADHD, we want to go off. If I do 2 days in a week in the office, I'm exhausted. And I'm like, how did I used to do that 5 days a week? Or even when I was in my previous career, I might go for 3 days straight through without any kind of break. So a good 36 hours, maybe
Yeah.
48 hours,
Yeah.
and it's like, wow, what damage have we done to ourselves
Agreed. I
with the
agree
way
with you
we've evolved society?
very much. Coming back to your daughter, again, similar question on the medication. Does your daughter not take medication either? No?
No, we haven't got to that point.
Okay.
Like I said, she wants to try a new therapist,
Therapist, yeah.
um, see how that works. What has happened, she was in sixth form, and she then decided that the school environment was just too overwhelming. She couldn't get into the college course because it was like beginning of October. So then she kind of was trying to do bits in school, and they were trying to accommodate her, and she just got to a point she's like, I just can't deal with this. So she's actually kind of taken a step back from sixth form. The school was very supportive in that way, and so she's been at home for a couple of months, and that's actually been great for her because she's now starting to tell me what she thinks, what she feels. She's opening up a lot more. She's a lot more relaxed. She's going out more with friends. So, I mean, big step for her during the summer was when she went with me to go and see Barbie. She hadn't been to the movies since she was 7 because she always watches like TV and things with the subtitles on. She doesn't like the noise because, of course, all the auditory sensory overload, which we never knew. I used to think, why does she always watch with subtitles, right? And then when we went to go and see Barbie, that was the reason why. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's not going to be able to cope with this. I can't believe she actually wants to go to the movies with me. And she was fine. She was sat right at the front, but she was very tired the next day. But that was a major breakthrough for her. The next major breakthrough, she's already identified she's going to come away on holiday with me in the summer. And she has not done anything like that with me. So there's more of a breakthrough with her being out of that environment, just at home. She's not doing anything. She'll watch a bit of TV in the day. She's doing a few little online courses, but she's just getting some time out,
Yeah.
and
And
just
that's
to
good. That's a good
hang
thing.
out, be herself.
Yeah, absolutely. And testament again to you to be able to support her and allow her to have that time out because human beings need that. I think this whole, you grow up, you go to school, it gets more intense. You go off to college or, and you get a job and stuff like that. And there's never any time for a break. And,
Mm,
I know myself, that overload happens regularly and you go, okay, I just have to keep pushing on because I have to
hmm
provide and so on and so forth, but it's bloody tough. So testament to you to be able to give her the space that she needs to be able to go at the pace that she needs to find her way, and that's a
mm,
wonderful thing. It really is. Have you just as you were saying that, going to the movies and the sensory overload, do you know have you come across Rich and Rox ever
no,
on any of the socials? So
no.
Rox she's got lovely lady. Actually, they live in either Basingstoke or Camden. It's one of the two.
Mm, hmm
And she's got blue hair on one side and dark hair on the other. Incredible singer. I'll send you some details afterwards.
Yeah.
And her husband, Rich, or her partner, Rich, they have kids. And he was a bank manager in Basingstoke for Barclays. And they've done so well on the socials, they've given up. He's given up the job as a bank manager.
Mm,
Rox has got ADHD, and she has an incredible talent at explaining her condition to people. And I've
mm.
spoken to them. I think they're wonderful. But she uses these loops that go in the ear.
We talked about that, and I was like, oh, shall we get that? But she's got her AirPods, right?
Okay.
and her AirPods are noise cancelling. And like
Perfect.
I have my AirPods, and like when I don't have the music on, and you notice how much sound they cut out, and you're like, oh my God, I nearly got run over. Actually, I nearly got run over the other day. I was just outside, funnily enough, and I had looked to my to my right before I crossed the road, and I know what, and I had my headphones in, and then I hear this this car comes along, nearly I'd got run over because I couldn't hear in the same way because they had cancelled out so much noise. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, these things are great, you
Yeah.
know? So that is the thing that we know when she does feel ready to like start college and everything, that she probably will need. She's probably going to need them when we go traveling. Just because I think that's going to be a lot of sensory overload. Luckily, it's not a long flight or anything, but that is going to be a major test for her. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's some great things coming out now, right, that can
Good.
really help, especially if you are like so auditory ADHD and auditory autism. So it does, but yeah, try not to get run over when you're wearing your things in your
Yeah.
ears.
It's interesting, actually. One of the places where I feel most relaxed, actually, because over the last 15 years, I've done a lot of international travel. And when I'm on an aeroplane, that background white noise that the engines of an airplane
It's
make while
nice.
it's in the air, it's zzz, and it does something in here. And I
Yeah.
find this sense of focus, concentration, and ability
I
to
fall asleep. Like it helps. Like I
do
have real
you.
problems with insomnia, and whenever we used to fly, and of course we flew a lot with
Yeah.
my dad being in the military, and we'd go
Yeah.
like on the Galaxy aircraft, and everyone would be wearing their earplugs. I never wore earplugs. I was like, no, this is great, and then I'd just fall asleep. And yeah, whenever I get on a plane, it's like I have to be careful if it's a short flight because I'm like I'm gonna fall asleep. So yeah,
Absolutely.
for me, it's relaxing.
Tell me, we've talked about you as a mother, your daughter, the challenges you face throughout the system, getting a diagnosis, allowing your daughter to have some space, you, trauma. There's quite a few takeaways here for people listening to this, right? And
Mm,
and I never want to downplay in any way the challenge that you or your daughter, or indeed anybody out there in the world,
yeah.
faces. I think it's tough for a woman. I really do, and I hate to say that I'm that demographic of the white male in his 50s, and I hate to be that.
But you're extremely switched on, George. So, you're not, it's not like you're well educated. You've gone out into the world to understand different perspectives. So, that makes a big difference, right?
You're very kind for saying that. But there's takeaways to be had here, right? I mean, whether you're in London or in New Zealand or Spain. I spoke to somebody recently in Barcelona, and the takeaways here are: be tenacious, right? Push the health services, push
Absolutely.
the mental health services
Push
harder.
against the system.
Yeah, yeah. But just keep
And don't
being
be afraid to
tenacious.
do it. Don't be afraid that, for me, there's this thing of, oh, you mustn't upset. You must, maintain the status quo, don't challenge things and that's how initially I kind of was made to feel with the school, right? The school kind of like, what are you challenging us for? This is behavior. And I was like, because I know my daughter.
Yeah,
I know my daughter. If this was rebellion, then she would be playing up at home, and it's not home she's running away from, it's school she's running away from, right? A child that has always loved school. So you tell me, has something happened in school, or is there something wrong with the environment of school? Right. So it's this thing of you're made to feel like you're wrong, what you're trying to do
mm,
because you're challenging. Um, and people that know me well know that there's two sides to me. And I'm either, if I'm in a situation, I'll either challenge to the extreme or I won't challenge at all.
yeah,
Most of
yeah.
the time I'm pretty much on the other side of challenge to the extreme and push the limits. I'm not always the biggest conformist. So yeah, don't be afraid to question and challenge and find alternative routes. Don't necessarily take what you're told at face value, you know, and just push up against the system and make someone, excuse me, sit up and listen to you. Because I
Yes.
think that's the hardest thing. That was definitely my biggest, I guess, challenge, was feeling like no one is actually listening to me and what I'm saying. You know, I'm talking, but it's almost like I'm mute.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, not being afraid, and probably maybe that was the good parts of my ADHD that were going, well, hang on, you're dealing with a crisis here, just crisis manage.
Yeah.
So that's maybe why I challenged a bit more. But I think for those that maybe don't have that, just don't be afraid to do it, because, you know, there will be someone that will listen. And
No,
the
that's a
more of us that
fantastic.
do that, the more of us can change society as a whole.
Agreed. And I think that's why I think in the case of neurodiversity, it's coming from the ground up. Actually, I'm seeing so many people now who are, you know, I didn't ever mention ADHD. Now I'm very open about it. Very
Oh,
open about it to
yeah.
people.
But
I
do
was
you
talking.
get, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So do you get, so so yeah, I've had environments where people are very accepting, very open, wanting to learn more. And, you know, they understand that this is something that we need to educate people about. And so that they're open to it. But I have recently come against people that, like I said, are kind of a bit more like, oh, ADHD, why do you mention it so much? And it's like, because I didn't know I had it pretty much most of my life. You know, it was, you know, 3 years, 2 years ago, just before my daughter died, you
Mm,
know. So it's relatively new for me, even though I connected the dots. But it's, you know, when you think about it like that, well, there's one reason. The second reason is because it's about educating other people and not being
yes.
afraid to, because it's always been
Yes.
this taboo, and because there's these associations with it. Oh, it's mental illness, right? In the case of my mother, it's mental
Yes.
illness. So therefore
Yes.
we must keep it hidden and
Yes.
taboo, and not look at what this is. There's something wrong with this child. So you've got those elements, right? And also, for me, it's a challenge. So I want people to be able to understand better why my behavior might be a certain way, particularly at work, right? So that they can spot maybe if I'm in a crisis, because I might not notice it myself,
Mm,
right? So if I'm arming them with the education and the knowledge that enables them, A, to understand what my boundaries are, what I need in order to be my best self at work, and equally to notice my warning signs when I might be going down a crisis route, and need someone to step in and go, hang on, you need to take some time out. Or hang on, are you struggling with understanding this? Can I help you with
can
this?
you be helped?
Right?
Yeah. Can you help?
Because
Yeah.
I'm not the best person at asking for help.
No.
You know, so there's that aspect to it. And, you know, because I do see it very much as a challenge, it's kind of my, yeah, I don't know, it's my dark shadow really that sits within me, is how I
Mm,
feel about it. There are times when it's not always so dark. Then I want to be able to bring that dark shadow out into the light and go, I don't have to be ashamed that I've got this dark shadow and that I don't feel great about it. Right. And I think the people that are able to feel that it gives them, you know, certain qualities, that are positive, and they can really see the good side of themselves, and they can see both sides. I
mm.
think that's amazing. And I really wish I could get to that point. And I'm hoping I'll get to that point someday. But unfortunately, I'm not there yet. So I want people to be able to understand why, for me, just getting up in the and getting out the door some days can be a real struggle,
A huge
and making
challenge.
it
Yeah.
through the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it's very funny actually. And since I started this channel, and I was talking to a wonderful lad from E1 last night. Actually,
Mm.
E1 is a postcode in London, very central London, and his name's Liam Chewy, and he's
Oh, I saw
ADHD.
that.
Did you? Yeah, lovely
Mm.
guy, lovely guy. been in trouble for fighting and all sorts. And you get the episode's on next Thursday. Once I get it published out. And you're always going to get haters, right? There are always. I've had comments on my YouTube channel, on my Spotify. It doesn't exist. And do you know what, Aestrid? Fuck them.
Yeah, really.
Right?
Fuck them.
Fuck them.
Yeah.
I don't care. Right? It's if you're not interested in other people's challenges, then go and play somewhere else. Go into another sandpit and go and play somewhere else, right? We've all got these challenges. We're all talking together, and the purpose of this conversation and others is to help other people understand who might have similar challenges as a parent, as a mother, as a daughter, right?
Mm-hmm.
In those environments, in your quiet moments, and go, do you know what? There are other people out there like me, and they sought this help, and they gave me these takeaways. And that's what this channel's about. I don't have time to listen to people pissing about with, it doesn't exist. It's this, it's that, it's the other. I don't care. Fuck them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So excuse my language, but I feel very strongly about that.
And I think that's great, because that's what we need more of, because, that's what changes things. Think about 30 years ago, what different medical conditions and things that we didn't talk about, right? And now we have a much better understanding. And that's all it is. It's because as human beings, we want to be able to understand one another, right?
Yes.
We want to be able to forge those connections. We want to have that, there's some people that you really go, oh God, that resonates with me, like when I heard Annie's story, there were parts of that I was like, wow, that really resonates with me. And you're like, I'm so thankful there's someone out there that's going to share their story. You can see the similarities in your own story, but no, you've got a different story to tell. But when you see that, it makes you then equally go, my story is just as valid, or how I feel as a person is just as valid. And that's all we want. We want to feel that we can be our true, authentic selves, not have to mask. For me particularly, I think that's where some of it comes from, is like I've had all these years of masking, not even realizing a lot of the time that's what I was doing.
Yes.
And I don't want my daughter to have to go through a society like that. I want her to be able to be accepted as, whether it's with labels or without labels. Her sister's a bit funny about it. She's like, she hasn't got ADHD, don't call it that,
I understand.
That's fine. Whatever Lucia wants is all I care about.
Yes.
But, it's about her being able to go, this is how I am. This is what I need in life. And if you don't understand that, then like you say, fuck you. But this is what I need, and just accept me as I am. Right. And that's
Absolutely.
all we want as human beings, to show some love, show some compassion. It's not just about empathy, it's compassion as well, because, there's good days, there's bad days, there's in-between days. And there's a whole raft of different emotions and experiences that go with it. So just accept people as they are, how they want to be accepted, and get over it.
Absolutely. Do you know, it's funny, the best thing that I ever did was set this podcast up. And when I was talking to people before doing that, someone said to me, be vulnerable, just be your real vulnerable self to the world. And ever since I've done that, the relationships around the world of people who write to me and the people who subscribe to this channel, just because they love listening to the stories. And it's not me, it's the people telling the stories, right? I've told mine, but the people who are telling the stories, people go, wow, thank you so much. Listen, I've got one last question for you, if that's okay.
That's fine.
And I think actually it's very interesting. And before I ask the question, I would love for you to come back in 6 months or a year and just give us an update on how things are progressing with Lucia, with yourself, your life and your tenacity, because you're a great human being. We've been in touch a few times, over the years, and it's there's a great connection there, and it's clearly what I call the ADHD connection. You know, it's wonderful. It really
I remember
is.
naughty George at school.
That's the one. Absolutely. You know, it's true. If only, if only. But would given if I ask the same question, and in your case, I don't know if the answer is going to be the one I kind of expect, but I need to ask it anyway. If I could click my fingers and say, you don't have ADHD anymore, I've taken it away, would you choose that path?
Gosh, that's such an interesting question. And I would expect myself on one level at that first instant of going, yes, but actually no, because I think that's what makes me a very creative person. You know, I was ballet, art, writing, all those things that I love that really spark that something in me. So I think my creativity is the good side, is that nice bright sun side of my ADHD.
Yes.
So I can see, those glimmer bits. And equally, would I have had a 16-year career in a career that I absolutely adored without the ADHD? I don't think I probably would, right? I mean, I don't know that, but I think the way my ADHD was at its best, operating at its best, which sounds a bit
Moronic. I know, but it isn't. I get it. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Bit of a paradox. It did. And that's what's made me a resilient person. That's what I guess has made me tenacious. That's what's made me able to go into battle for my daughter.
Yeah.
So as much as I've spent some of this podcast going, I hate my ADHD and it's a real challenge. It is, but I'm just being truthful of how I feel a lot of the time about it, right? There's times where I go, oh my God, did I actually say this to this person? Or, when you have the verbal diarrhea and you just go on, and the person, you're like, I did not listen to that person at all because I couldn't stop this flow. So podcast is probably not the best place for me.
It's best place. It's the best place for long form podcasting.
No, go on. But it's also that thing of, you've just made me come to a realization that no, I probably wouldn't want it to be taken away because that's what makes me. And that comes back to that point of we just have to accept ourselves as we are and go, that's okay. I'm not the norm. I don't want to be the norm anyway, because that's not my type,
Yeah.
It's not interesting. And so therefore, that is what makes us interesting people. We're multifaceted, and that's what makes me love other people and be compassionate and just want to kind of share and help others to be themselves. And
I agree completely.
Not want to say, I don't want to have ADHD anymore.
No, I get it. I do. Aestrid Solberg, this has been a delightful conversation. I've loved every second of it. I can't wait to see you in 6 months, a year, and come back and do another episode. Okay.
I would love to come back and thank you so much for having me, George. It's been great to, kind of help you on your journey and what you're doing, because I think it's great, to have that, taking that bold step and going out there and, like you say, making yourself vulnerable and doing something like this is amazing. So always big love for you, George, and what you're doing.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. I'm going to press stop, but stay on for a second, okay?